Tony, thank you very much for those words of welcome, and thank you very much for an opportunity to be back at the Institute, which is always a great pleasure. I'm a great supporter of the work of the Institute, both in its former incarnation as the Institute for European Affairs and its more recent incarnation as the Institute for International and European Affairs, which I think was a timely change, not just of title, but also reflecting the fact that you can only look at European affairs in a broader global context. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk today about trade policy, even if there are many old friends and distinguished people I've had the occasion to work with in the past, but the one who's intimidating me most is Dermot McAleese, sitting back there, who actually taught me what little I know about international trade, and who probably still hasn't decided whether he's going to give me a 2-1, a 2-2, or maybe a slightly less glorious mark. So anything I say right is all the responsibility of Dermot. The mistakes are all my own, I assure you. I wanted to talk about trade policy from three main perspectives. I thought it would be useful maybe to just look back a little to see where we're coming from. Secondly, to look at how the financial crisis and, of course, the global recession is affecting trade policy, and then try to look a bit more towards the future, which is the main theme of the talk. Of course, all of this is happening at a time of great great uncertainty. Firstly, on the economic side. Again, I look at Dermot, but we don't know whether we're in a V or a U or an L or a W, and we're not entirely sure whether we've seen the end of the unpleasant surprises. And there's no doubt about it, as a sort of spoiled economist, I recognise that we're testing the limits of economic policy at the present time. And we hope, and it looks as though we have got things under control. But I think all that has to carry a slight health warning that, watch out for the unforeseen. And so everything we say and predict about the future, I think, has to have that health warning that we may still see some unpleasant surprises simply because this thing took us by surprise. And by definition, we have to have the humility to admit that we don't know everything and that there could be some more surprises. Secondly, as Tony has mentioned, it's a time, certainly in Europe, but not only in Europe, of political change. We're having the renewal of the Commission. President Barroso has been unanimously confirmed as the nominee of the European Council to be the next president of the Commission. He still has to pass through the Parliament, where the main debate will take place in September. And of course, we're not entirely sure what will be the political orientation of the Parliament, which is a new Parliament. We still have to see what shape it takes. And of course, we have to have a new Commission, which hopefully, if everything goes okay with the referendum, which I certainly don't take for granted, we will be operating on the basis of Lisbon, which would give the Parliament an increased say in trade matters, and of course, which would then mean we would be looking at nominations of commissioners and portfolios into the autumn. If by any chance, if things go differently, of course, then we'll be operating on the basis of Nice. But then, nonetheless, the same political dynamic will apply as to what will be the narrative of the Barroso II Commission on economic and trade policy, and what will be the policy of the Parliament in this regard. So these are, if you like, some of the Mr. Rumfeld's knowable unknowns. My first remark was the category of the unknowable unknowns. Now, if I look back on trade policy in the last few years, the main policy framework has been the Global Europe document of 2006, where Peter Mandelson sought to demonstrate the link firmly between the Lisbon internal agenda of jobs and growth and trade, and the contribution of trade to the jobs and growth debate. And I think this was based on the idea of trading opportunities abroad, help boost competitiveness at home, and this link needs never to be forgotten. Our economic strength today in a global marketplace depends entirely on our ability to remain globally competitive. And some 2/3 of European imports are inputs to the production processes. Because very often when you talk about trade, people think you're a sort of an export salesman, and you're rated on how much you actually export. But of course, imports are just as important. They bring benefits, and they are the benefits of trade don't just come from having to be able to export more than other people. They also come from the imports. And it's very important, I think, to understand that in Europe, 2/3 of our imports actually then go into the production process. They're not finished products. They're intermediate products, where we add value, in some cases consume them, and in some cases re-export them. So Europe very much needs to import in order to remain competitive and to be able to export. And this is a key feature of the European economy. And I think that we can also then understand the link to the globalized economy. In the globalized economy, where European companies source and sell their products down long global supply chains, Europe's economic strength at home depend on our competitiveness in the world. Of course, we must also ensure that our companies have access to third markets, many of which are less open than our own. There is no doubt about it that Europe is one of the most open trading economies in the world, and that sometimes the opposite impression is created, but I don't believe that it's substantiated by the numbers. And the growing interdependence between economies means that countries all share a stake in each other's prosperity and development. And EU competitiveness depends on growing prosperity in our major and future markets. As Chris Patton used to say, and I think I've quoted it here before, forgive me if you've heard it, the only thing that should worry us more than a successful China would be an unsuccessful China. At a time of rapid change and concerns about the pace and nature of change, Europe needs to make the case for openness and engagement and not for isolation and retreat. And this message resonates even more strongly today as the world economy is in the process of recovering from the recent financial crisis and its consequential effects on the real economy. The policy agenda that we've pursued emphasizes, of course, our core commitment to the World Trade Organization and the benefits of multilateral trade rules, but it also includes some new elements to improve the market access that we're delivering for European business. So the European Commission has remained a firm proponent of the WTO. We almost succeeded last year in brokering a deal. And one of the features of that time, even though the deal was not concluded, was that nobody blamed Europe. And I think for those of you who are familiar with some of these debates over many, many long years, the default person to blame for any breakdown of international trade talks was always Europe, and usually the common agricultural policy. I think it was a remarkable change that we managed actually to position ourselves in the forefront of those working for a deal and contributing to a deal. And when it collapsed, everyone acknowledged that Europe had played an extremely constructive role. Cold comfort, I recognize, since we didn't in the end get the deal. But it does show that there has been a repositioning of European trade policy recognized globally. In parallel, because we knew that the DDA was not guaranteed of success, but also because there are things you cannot solve multilaterally, there are things you cannot negotiate in the multilateral framework, we've also launched ambitious bilateral trade discussions with India, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries. We now have a draft final agreement with Korea, and I am very confident that it will prove possible to initial and conclude this deal after the summer, and it will then be presented formally for signature to the member states, I hope, early next year. We've also focused new resources on better protection of intellectual property rights and fair access to raw materials. These are two issues of enormous importance to European companies. We're a continent which not heavily endowed with raw materials. We need access to raw materials for transform, and of course intellectual property, because much of our exports are in the high value end. The protection of intellectual property is a crucial issue for European business. Now, we are, as I say, taking this agenda forward in a number of ways. In particular, we have sought to negotiate a very ambitious deal with Korea. I think the deal which is on the table is probably one of the most ambitious free trade agreements ever concluded globally, both in terms of its scope, its coverage, both in terms of non-tariff barriers. It contains a remarkable chapter on non-tariff barriers, but also what it does in other areas such as intellectual property, recognition of geographical indications, even industrial subsidies. So this agreement really represents a remarkable opportunity for Europe at a time of considerable economic difficulty to reaffirm our commitment to free trade by being able to conclude an ambitious and comprehensive free trade deal with a partner such as Korea. I think this sends a very powerful message, not only of confidence in ourselves, but also to the global system, that even in times of difficulty, we are still willing to enter into mutually beneficial free trading agreements with important partners. We are also, of course, enhancing our dialogue with China, which is much more complex and a much more difficult dialogue. We are now China's biggest customer, and it's clear that this is a relationship of huge importance. It's also clear, of course, that we do not bring to this dialogue, as do the Americans, the same political cohesion that we bring in terms of our economic cohesion. And this is one of the challenges for Europe, that we are in many ways an economic giant, but still at this point politically less well organized and more inclined to take divergent views, which is the state of development that our citizens wish for, but I'm forced to observe it still puts us at something of a disadvantage in international relations on occasions. And we've been working hard in a new element of the Global Europe strategy, which was the market access strategy, designed to create partnerships between the Europeans, between the Commission, Member States, and business to address very specific market barriers in third countries. It struck me, and has struck me for many years, that when you look at the diplomatic presence, the collective diplomatic presence of Europeans in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Tokyo, and you compare it to that of the Americans, we usually outnumber them 3 or 4 times to 1. But I'm afraid we don't get 3 or 4 times the bang for our buck. And one of the things we wanted to do was to get an increased focus of really cooperative activity between our member states, the Commission offices, the Commission representations, and the business community to really leverage Europe's considerable strength in order to address very specific barriers which our industries face in those markets, whether it's China or Brazil or India or even smaller markets. And we've had some small successes in Mexico, in Japan, in Korea, in the area of cosmetics. We've worked closely with the United States to suspend tariff increases on combine harvesters in Russia, and we've reduced technical barriers to exports of wines and spirits to Malaysia, Thailand, India, and Colombia. I recognize these are not individually glamorous or earth-shattering achievements, but they represent a real extra economic value for our industry and real improved export opportunities, which is ultimately what this is about. Now, on the trade, on the current economic crisis, just a reminder that Europe went into the crisis with an extremely strong position in international trade, something which, if you walked out onto the street and you asked people, where does Europe stand in international trade, they would probably say, oh, well, we have a huge deficit. In fact, it's not true. In 2007, the EU was the world's largest exporter of goods, with just over 16% share of global exports. During the past decade or so, when emerging countries such as China have been playing an increasing role in global exports, we have also maintained a higher share than other developed countries. The US and Japan now respectively account for 11% and 6% of world market for manufactured goods. So we have really moved in to be one of the leading exporters. We are also the global leader in exports of services. Nearly 28% of the world market, against 19% for the US and 5% for Japan. We're also the world's biggest investor and the principal host of foreign direct investment. When intra-EU stocks are excluded, the EU owns 38% and hosts 29% of world investment stocks. That is a very, very striking figure. I'm also struck by a figure from a recent study by the American Chamber of Commerce in Brussels, by Joe Quinlan, where he signals that US industry earns as much from its investment in Belgium as from all its investment in China. And this highlights the continuing importance of the transatlantic marketplace, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, China and India and Brazil are certainly the countries of the future. Now, a very important point to make here is that the EU's overall strong performance in this area is largely due to an upgrading of the quality of our exports, combined with our capacity of our companies to sell products at premium prices because of quality, branding, and related services. And I think this is a point which is perhaps relevant in looking at Ireland's future positioning of itself in the global world. We account for more than 30% of the world market for these types of products, as much as that of the United States and Japan combined. And these products represent about half our exports. It is clear the only way we can stay ahead of the curve and continue to have a competitive edge on the Chinese, on the Indians, on the Brazilians, on the ASEAN countries, is indeed to build on this ability to sell quality products at premium prices. Now, of course, this has knock-on consequences for domestic policies, and this is the only way in which we will maintain high levels of employment, wages, and social protection. But it also requires us to make the necessary investment, in particular in education, training, skills, and innovation, without which we will not keep this qualitative edge. And the fact is, and one should not be complacent, that we are trailing behind in several high-tech products, whereas countries such as China and others are rapidly catching up. We cannot rest on our laurels and assume that we can keep this preeminent place indefinitely. And we have to ensure that the EU's capacity in the future to keep its products at the cutting edge of quality and innovation. Now, if I turn to the current crisis and the extreme difficulties which we're now facing, it's clear that trade policy was not the root cause of the crisis. Financial market regulation and macroeconomic policy are not decided by the WTO in Geneva. And we also know that the crisis was largely driven by the financial crisis. But the distinguishing feature of this situation is that it is the first time, I think, in world economic history, and don't ask me when I say that begins, but it is the first time in certainly chartered world economic history that every country in the world has gone into recession at the same time. And this is a completely new phenomenon which we've never had to deal with before. We've always had situations of cyclical activity in different countries, and of course, depending on their weight in the economy, the global economy, this had a bigger, greater or lesser effect. The United States was a classic example. But when you have a situation where everyone goes into recession at the same time, it is clear that we are in a whole new paradigm. And it is clear that the crisis has demonstrated the extent of global economic interlinkages. Global production chains and massive trade in intermediate goods meant that trade has grown faster than GDP, all during the upturn, for many, many years, I think going back to about over 25 years now. Trade has grown faster than GDP. But this falls much more quickly in a recession. And we've seen absolutely dramatic fall-off in trade flows since the crisis began last year. In recent months, most major economies have seen exports 20 to 30% lower than in 2008, and Japanese exports in February of 2009 were half what they were the previous year. I turn to my former professor. There is obviously a statistical phenomenon at work here, which is, of course, that probably the traditional way of measuring trade there was quite a lot of double counting going on as we measured products which moved at various stages of evolution several times across different frontiers. So when you were talking about selling a product from A to F many years ago, you're now talking about that product going from A to B to C to D to E, finally ending up in F and probably being exported to G. And of course, when you stop buying the product in G, the trade flow implications flow right back through the whole system and through multiple countries. And that explains to a certain extent why there's an even bigger fall-off in trade flows than there is in economic activity. Now, in spite of the modest improvements of the latest data, and I go back to my V, my U, or my W, or my L. Unfortunately, the latest forecasts from both the IMF and the WTO see world trade declining by between 10 and 12% this year. We, the Commission, are forecasting that the EU economy will shrink by about 4%. And the latest IMF prediction is a decrease of nearly 5%. And unfortunately, unemployment is set to rise further in the EU from its current level of 8.9%, and the current level in the United States is even higher. And let's face it, how many years ago did we ever think we would see a situation where Europe in a recession would actually have slightly better employment performance than the United States? But we are moving probably towards 11% next year. I think one of the interesting things about this has been that so far the global consensus in favor of free trade has held fairly solidly. There's been some criticism that the G20 meeting initially in Washington, then in London, and now meeting again in Pittsburgh in September, that, well, there's been a commitment to not increase protection, but that you see protectionism on the rise. I have to say, as a practitioner, yes, there are incidents of protectionism out there. The Buy America movement in the United States is particularly worrying. The Buy Chinese movement in China with the stimulus package there is a source for concern. Russia has been putting up tariffs. And there are other incidents. But globally, and looked at across, the big picture, I must say there has not been a major move towards protectionism. And I think the global consensus in favor of free trade and open markets is held up remarkably well. But I must put a caveat on that, which is, of course, that there's always the risk that as unemployment starts to go up, the political reaction to the crisis begins to change in nature. And it may be that there's a certain time lag effect in terms of the consequences for trade and the degree of consensus about the benefits of trade. Now, the weak economic outlook, in my view, only strengthens the arguments in favor of concluding the DDA. This is because there's a double dividend in the DDA. There's the benefit it gives, the boost it would give the global economy, which is estimated somewhere to be around about $150 billion a year, which someone scathingly said to me in Washington, $150 billion doesn't even buy you a bank these days. Well, okay, but still, it's $150 billion, and it's better than not having $150 billion, it seems to me, but maybe I don't have the sort of Washington perspective on trillions and billions. But it's also the double benefit of what would happen if you don't have the DDA, because if you don't have the DDA and people put their tariffs back up to where they could, I'm not saying they necessarily will, but if they did, you would suck about $350 billion out of the world economy. You would reduce global welfare by that amount. So I could say that the benefit is 150 plus 350 billion, which takes you, I think, to 500 billion, and that maybe buys you 3 banks, and it's starting to look more attractive. But I do think that the need to conclude the Doha Round is all the more urgent. Now, to be frank, it is not going to be easy. We've had a new Indian government elected. We have yet to see exactly how they position themselves. No doubt about Prime Minister Singh's commitment, but India still has some issues in the DDA. And of course, we have a new U.S. administration who have to try and take some ownership of this matter, and who face, let's be frank, a very difficult domestic situation in Congress, in the Senate, and in the House of Representatives. I don't know if any of you have been to Washington recently, but the mood there is not particularly pro-free trade or pro-DDA. And so clearly, even if the instincts of the administration are to try to move this forward, they face a difficult challenge. And I think the rest of us in the WTO have to find ways of helping the United States see the value of this deal, maybe see additional value that can be found through further negotiations, in order that the Obama administration can take some ownership and try to sell this deal to their constituents. But it's not going to be an easy task. Of course, the crisis and the rising unemployment will highlight the importance of social policies to accompany those who lose out because of trade. I am a free trader, but I'm not at all naive about the fact that free trade does produce winners and losers sectorally and regionally. There are sectors which inevitably decline over time because they're overtaken by more competitive industries elsewhere. There are regions which suffer because they depend heavily on one factory or one economic activity for their wealth, and if that is phased out or overtaken by global competitors, then you need to have reconversion. And this is a highly important issue. I think we do it quite well in Europe, probably better than in the United States. But we are certainly going to face challenges in this, not least at a time when the public finances are so challenged by the present crisis. So it's not easy to find the priorities to allocate the necessary funds. In Europe, we have, of course, the Globalization Adjustment Fund, which is precisely intended to try and accompany workers who find themselves displaced because of trade. And trade policy itself will have an important role to play. It's clear to me that trade is part of the solution to this crisis and not part of the problem. Trade is, if you like, an additional external stimulus in the way that the fiscal stimulus policies are domestically. And if we don't have a growth in trade, it will be extremely difficult to find a way out of this current crisis. And that applies to whether it is in the multilateral context of the DDA or whether it is bilateral trade agreements. We must not only keep markets open, but indeed further improve market access if we are to contribute to finding our way out of this crisis. So, what does that mean for the future? Well, I think we know that fragile financial systems, shrinking economies and rising unemployment make for a potentially dangerous combination. We have at least two periods really, well certainly one classic period, the 30s, but we also know that the globalization of the late 19th century and early 20th century did not end happily. And I think we have to have a very particular responsibility to make sure that on this occasion we avoid that happening. I think the European Union has shown very firm global leadership in its response, whether it is in the issue of rescuing banks, playing a catalyst role in rejigging financial regulation, or whether it is the establishment of the G20 process, which is in its infancy, but which has the advantage of bringing together all the key players of the global economy in order to try to find solutions which are in everyone's interest and which have the support of all the major economic actors, by which I mean you move out beyond the G8 into including China and India and Brazil and other Asian countries, because we need each other to try to get out of this crisis. We will not do this at anyone's expense. It's another point I make frequently about the WTO. The WTO is probably the only working model of the 21st century global order that we have, where you actually have a more representative group of countries around the table trying to broker a deal. If we can't actually get a breakthrough on trade, which is something we have some 50 years of experience of negotiating, how much more difficult is it going to be to address issues such as financial regulation or indeed climate change, which is going to be a major challenge at the end of this year. So I think that we have the global response has been positive, and I think everyone is anxious to try to avoid the downward spiral that could result from any beggar my neighbor policy of protectionism. And we also, I think, as I've said before, need to pursue our bilateral and regional negotiations with Korea, with India, in order to try to make sure that we continue this process of opening markets as the only way forward. Of course, we also have to look at the new generation of problems in trade, because it's not just about tariffs, it's not just about the classic trade dilemma, it's also about the beyond the border issues. As I pointed out, the strong role we play in services and investment. And these are areas where many of the barriers that our businesses face are actually not tariff in nature, but they are regulatory. They're to do with local legislation. And this is an area where we have to work extremely hard. By the way, one of the features of the Lisbon Treaty is that it gives the European Union additional possibilities to negotiate on investment and to include strong investment chapter as part of any future free trade agreements we would negotiate if that is eventually the treaty we operate under. So I would like to end there and to say that I think the challenge for us is to continue to make the case for open markets and the benefits of free trade at a time when there is no doubt about it. The effect of the financial crisis, the loss of faith in the market, people saying the state is back. The problem is the state probably is back. The state is back, but the state is also a bit short of money. So unfortunately, it cannot solve all the problems which are there. And I think fundamentally, there will have to be a return to faith in intelligently regulated markets. And I certainly believe that in trade, as in any other area, we need intelligent regulation of the market. We don't have, by the way, unfettered free trade. There are a wide range of regulations governing trade, going from health and safety to phytosanitary areas. So we don't live in a world of unfettered free trade, but we do live in a world of very open markets compared to the situation which has prevailed in the past. And this has brought us huge benefits. We have to keep being able to explain to people that this is a way out of the crisis, that any protectionist reflex could only lead to a downward spiral, which would be in everybody's worst interest, which would aggravate and accumulate the problems which we're experiencing now. But I recognize that this is going to be a challenge to continue to make this case, to demonstrate it, at a time of rising unemployment, at a time undoubtedly of some social discontent because of this. And we have an obligation to make that case. But at the same time, of course, it will require us to have in place the safety nets and the compensation measures which enable people to live with some of the churning and adjustments which come from trade, without which we will undoubtedly lose popular support for an element of our policy which is certainly a cornerstone of Europe's prosperity and our future competitiveness in the 21st century. Thank you very much indeed, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Thank you.